Welcome to this discussion on dynamics of globalization in Indian society. This discussion relates to our MA program in Sociology, MSO 004, Sociology in India. Globalization as a term has widely been used by the student, academia, and all variety of the intelligentsia. It has been a process of understanding the society and its interconnectivity with the wider world. When you are sociologically using the term, you will have to have a specific connotation and specific understanding of the process of globalization as a socio-cultural and political reality. When we talk about globalization, we talk about a process of integration of the people across the globe with common social, economic, and political appetite. What is usually understood, that is a process of commonness in the social areas, in the economic areas, in the political areas, also in the cultural areas. And by doing so, globalization talks about a process of transference, a process of transition, a process of transcendence, a process of disembeddedness, also a process of recontextualization of varieties of social, economic, and political realities of the society. Come to the process of transference, because when we are talking about a kind of a common economic appetite, we are talking about the transference of goods and services across the globe. What are those goods and services that can be transferred? All kind of consumers goods, the electronic goods, the consumer durables, even the everyday consumer items. So a kind of transference. When we are talking about this transference, we are also talking about a kind of a trade that can grow across the globe. So what we are talking about, a kind of transference of goods and services, consumer goods and non-consumer goods that can be transferred across the globe, because it will have a common kind of economic appetite. Take the example of McDonald's food, a kind of a burger, which is especially an American product. Now it is a kind of going from one part of the globe to another part of the globe. So many a time people have very lightly talked about globalization in terms of food terms. There is a kind of a McDonaldization of the world. This is only one dimension talked about the transference of goods and services. Similarly, take into consideration transference of any new ideas. The way some Facebook or WhatsApp messages are now produced, it can go across the globe with a click of the mouse or a touch of a finger. It can move across the globe. So what we are trying, transference of goods, services, ideas, information, it transferring very, very fast. So along with transference, what is required in terms of compression of the time and space. So earlier, transference was taking a lot of time. Now the time-space compression, it has been widely compressed, so that is within a touch of finger, that information, that ideas are going from across the globe. Also in terms of physical transference, the time-taking process, it has been widely reduced. So what we find, the transference has been a part of globalization, number one. Number two, in terms of transition, what we find, the whole process of globalization has brought transition in human action. What kind of transition we are talking about? Transition in terms of certain action. Some action earlier we took locally, now we are taking many of the transition action globally. Those transition is taking in terms of thought also. Earlier it is thought of only in terms of local ideas, now it is thought of in terms of global ideas. It's more concern of the environment, it's a global concern. Climate is a global concern. Animal right is a global concern. So what we find, a kind of a concern, that there is a transition in the concern. There is a transition in the thought, transition in the action. Transition earlier is a physical action. Now a lot of transition is taking place in the cyberspace. So what we find a cyber community, a different kind of a community formation without having the face-to-face interaction. We are having a cyber epistemic community in terms of connectivity through internet, etc. like this. So transition we find both in terms of technology from earlier the technology which is industrial technology. Now we find a different kind of a technology in this case. So what we find for a transparent to transition. Now we find a transcendence. What we find a transcendence of varieties of the identities also taking place. Earlier, various localized groups, those who were concrete in their identities. Now we find the formation of various global kind of a group are taking place in terms of transcendence of various identities. Say, as I gave the example of, say, gay rights group, having the international, a global group. Take into animal rights group, human rights group, environmental group. So what's the, so many local identities getting transcended over a period of time, and those transcendence also taking place in terms of action. So whatsoever we're talking about transference, transition and transcendence, those are in terms of concrete, in terms of virtual, in terms of action, in terms of thoughts, in terms of philosophies. So what we are finding, a varieties of social processes of action, those are articulated globally and locally, people getting interconnected. Those processes of global local connectivity has also created two kind of phenomenon. One is a kind of enormous process of disembeddedness, a kind of a decontextualization. Earlier realities, those who are considered to be these realities in terms of localized social relation, we find that those localized social relation has not remained localized. Those have become widely globalized, widely cutting across the geographical boundaries of several nation states or within the region. Friendship is not having a particular boundary. Now friendship with the touch of the mouth, that is, people from one part of the globe can develop a friendship with the people of another part of the globe. In the process of developing those relationships, that earlier kind of a structured relationship, immediate requirement of visibility, immediate requirement of exchange of ideas in terms of proximity, those have been decontextualized. In the process of decontextualization, we find a recontextualization process. What is recontextualization? That is, earlier, those who are not considered, those who are considered to be irrelevant, impossible, those are found to be a realm of possibility. So, in terms of, in terms of exchange of ideas, books and literature. Earlier, it was quite difficult for a research scholar to undertake a research without going to the library. Somebody is to go to the library, look for a book or literature, then they will have an interaction with other kind of a scholar face to face. Now we find so many virtual resources, so many books, literature, journal, those were available across the globe. Need not go to a scholar's house or a teacher's house. People can sit in the room, interact online, and develop a new kind of contextualization. So what do we find? A new process of contextualization and recontextualization has started coming in. So what we find, the whole process of globalization has set in motion a new process of transference, transition, transcendence, embeddedness and disembeddedness in the society. Here David Gordon widely talked about the recent globalization as an unprecedented world. That is that earlier also there was a globalization. I'll come little later for that. But recent globalization in which human beings are getting interconnected, integrated across the globe, it is a very unprecedented phenomenon, because earlier there was globalization, but those globalization, those kind of borderless transcendence, transition and transference was not taking place. Rather, now it is taking place in a wider context, with a larger volume and with a larger speed. Those kind of changes now, what it has brought in, a wider kind of a change in the relationship between the society, state and the market. Now earlier the relationship between state, society and market was widely defined. Now we find those relationship has been widely changed. The change has been widely mediated by the technology and the economic transformation. So what kind of a change we are talking about? Let us go, that is, what was the nature of the earlier society, how it has affected us. We will go to that. In earlier context, what we find that is a society was a self-regulated society. A self-regulated society was sufficing its own consumption need by producing itself. So it was a self-regulated society. In Indian context, what we usually talked about a self-sufficient village community system. The market was away from the society. Even though there was a market, the relationship of the market was not that explicit. People were surviving through a non-market system, through barter system, and a kind of a mutual interdependence on each other. Carl Polanyi, in his famous book, The Great Transformation, he widely talked about a pre-industrial society, a self-regulated society, and a self-regulated market. What was that self-regulated society? It is society regulated itself, and that society was in its own place, and it was producing, consuming, and sufficing its own need. Gradually, as the society developed, at the process of industrialization started coming in, it became a marketized production, a more commoditization of production. Gradually, market started coming in. When started market coming in, it was society, it was not deciding the need, because society started deciding the need in terms of what kind of other supplies available. So society started creating a need of its own variety. Thus, supply-demand relationship started coming in a new way. So what we find that is a kind of a market started entering it. The market started deciding the need of the society. So what we found that society started getting regulated. So at least societal need started getting conditioned by the market. In the process, society and market got embedded in the same situation. Market started coming in. When the market started gradually coming in, because of its own influence over the economy, market started controlling the society. So it has become the market regulated society. And in that market regulated society, it was the market become quite more powerful. Market started expanding. With the expansion of the market, it started looking for new market and new product, and it started also gradually controlling the state. And gradually what happened, there emerged the whole process of a laissez-faire, a free-market relationship. And within this relationship, the importance of the market started prevailing the importance over the state. You can look into the importance, the emergence of the East India Company, a kind of a market, a kind of a company started regulating the state, and gradually at a later phase it got regulated by the state. So what we find gradual has been emergence of the market. This emergence of the market in the state formation within the society, in the whole transition, Carl Polanyi talks about the great transformation, because it is the market that was deciding. But that market determinism also brought great depression in the earth, because market determinism pushed the growth of capitalism. Gradually, it also pushed the growth of colonialism, and it started spreading. The capitalism and colonialism started spreading across the globe. That free market was unable to suffice the social need. The world economies faced the Great Depression in the late 1920s, and huge quantum of unemployment and social insecurity started coming in. America started giving a new deal. Within the new deal, there emerged the new welfare society. The welfare society started coming in. It is the state again should come to the center place, and state should decide the welfare activities, because it should take care of the employment, education, and health. And ultimately, a new kind of phenomenon of social security came. So what we find that in the gradual transition from a self-regulated society to a market-regulated society gradually emerged a welfare society. What we find the second great transformation in human society, and that transition, that thing keep on continuing on this earth till perhaps late 1980s, because the welfare state started coming in, and but within the welfare state there emerged the two kind of development. One development is the capitalist world, that is the all NATO countries on the one hand, the Western Europe and America one side. Then we find the Warsaw country, that is the communist bloc on the other. Another kind of a world we found in starting from early 1940s, it continued till 1990s. So what we find that two great transformation already, Poliani talked about the great transformation, arrival of the market. Second transformation took place with the Great Depression and emergence of the welfare state. And third transformation, perhaps the victory of the Western capitalism and what Fukuyama talks about, the emergence of the new economic liberalism, is a new phenomenon of globalization that started from 1990s. This phenomenon, new economic liberalization that started from 1990s, it gave a new kind of economic framework. Because neoliberal economic globalization started with the triumph of market capitalism, and it started talking about another trade, a kind of a new kind of business and economic arrangement. With the business and economic arrangement that was decided by the World Bank, IMF and the Washington Consensus, the major financial institution located in and around Washington. And they widely propagated a kind of a new economic world that is to be founded on privatization in the major economic investment. It's also talked about all those economies of the world, they should adopt the path of structural adjustment program. And the structural adjustment program is to be guided by World Trade Organization's special treaty, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and General Agreement on Trade. And within that, it started widely specifying that is the whole dictum of this most favored nation to be minimized, anti-dumping to come in, and there should be borderless economic transition. So what we find, the new phenomena of economic globalization started coming in. This economic globalization started talking about new framework of economic activities across the globe. Again, the market came in the forefront, and the state became one of the enabler in providing the legal, procedural and institutional framework for the smooth economic activities across the globe, that is the borderless trade. So what it simultaneously started coming in 1990s, a new kind of economic framework. It started with new kind of a technological innovation. 1990s saw a kind of emergence of new kind of economic atmosphere across the globe that started from mid-1970s. Mid-1970s started talking about a kind of emergence of new economic environment. In this new economic environment, they started talking about it is not only the land, labor and capital that was factor of production. Most important is human capital, that is the human mind. What they started talking about the contribution of a human mind in the production process, and that human mind started producing what they started talking about in terms of enormous proliferation of information and communication technologies. And world economy started talking about and started giving a lot of equation between had the level of economic development is linked to had the quantum of educational and skill development, and also had the capacity of production of knowledge. So knowledge become commoditized, and it become one of the factors of production, and by producing the knowledge, one become one of the movers and shakers of the world economy. In American economy, earlier it was the industrial labor force that was widely contributing, that that is the industrial sector contributing to the GDP. Starting from 1980s, mid-1980s, it widely came out that is American economy and then most world economy, developed world economy, was widely contributed by the service sector. Service sector is widely contributed by the product of the mental power, that is capacity to produce knowledge, and that is higher the contribution to the education, higher is the contribution to the service sector, and higher contribution to the service sector led to the higher contribution to the GDP. And ultimately there emerged a knowledge economy, and this knowledge economy got a wide push with the new technological innovation in 1990s, started from mid-1980s and got wider exposure in 1980s, that is information and communication technologies, that is computer, internet and mobile, that provide the enormous connectivity. And it became the co-constituent of globalization. That is what he talked about this by co-constitute. If there is a process of globalization, the globalization is to be smoothened by ICT, and ICT should be supplemented by the enormous production of the educated manpower. So it talked about a knowledge economy, that is production and dissemination, mass production and mass dissemination of the knowledge for the wealth and employment of the country. Earlier, knowledge was produced only for the sake of generation of the knowledge. Now knowledge is produced, mass produced for the generation and wealth of employment of the country, and it can be produced only through the intervention of education, ICT, and an environment of globalization. So globalization gave the push for a new economic order. That new economic order is widely guided by a knowledge-driven economy. And this organization production also widely become a new site of production and dissemination of knowledge. Along with this production of dissemination of knowledge, there also came a new culture of consumption, what we call this neoliberal consumption culture. If one is to look into the Indian social framework, what kind of global framework it has come in, what kind of economic structure it has produced. India introduced itself a new structural adjustment program in 1991. And in this new structural adjustment program, it opened up its economy, and new kind of interpenetration of information and communication technology started coming in. And in the process, it's found that in 2020 now, in 1991, it is only 0.01% of the people had access over internet. Now in India 2020, more than 56% of the people having access over internet. In 1991, not even 2% people are having either landline or mobile phone. Now more than 91% of Indian population having access over mobile phone or land connection. Now higher education institution, when India got independence, number of the universities in the country are less than 100. Now in our country we are having more than 950 universities and more than 4,200 colleges. When India got independence, roughly around 2% of Indian educated workforce are going to the higher education. Now more than 27% of Indian population goes to the threshold of education, higher education. So what we find, a framework of education, a framework of technology has given a boost for the development of a knowledge-driven economy that provides the space of globalization in Indian society. Let us look into India's contribution to the service sector. Agriculture in India now gives to the extent of 15% of the GDP, and it accommodates roughly around 49% of the labor force. The industry in our country accommodates roughly around 24% of the labor force and also gives roughly around 24 to 25% of the GDP. If we look into the service sector, it has been enormous proliferation with the expansion of education and ICT. It now contributes more than 61% of the GDP and accommodates roughly around 31% of the labor force. Now we find that India is gradually moving towards a new kind of economic framework, and that is guided by service-driven, knowledge-based economy. So there is a new kind of economic framework where India stands today. Now come to this social framework if we put together. However, India has not been able to emerge as a full-fledged knowledge power as yet, because 48% of its labor force are now still in the agricultural sector. Majority of them are the migrant laborer. Majority of them are agricultural laborer, sharecroppers or the tenant or small cultivators. They seasonally migrate to the urban areas for this in search of employment. So India stands in the threshold of an economic order. That economic order is widely have a mix of traditionality on the one hand, modernity on the other, localization on the one hand and globalization on the other, and also we find a mix of part agricultural society, part industrial society, part knowledge-based society, and a part globalized society. So we find that it's the kind of fluidity on the one hand in terms of knowledge-driven information society, consolidation on the other in terms of traditionality and agricultural society. Within that, we find a varieties of new formation. What are those varieties of new formation? We find that people being educated, they exercise new kind of choices. And those choices are exercised in terms of select of employment, select of friend, selection of political choices. We find there is enormous proliferation of digital natives. India now we find more than 135 crores of population, of which more than 65% of the population belong to the age group of below 35 years. They are the digital natives. Most of them, they have access over the internet and the mobile telephone, and they look in the world in terms of new aspiration. They are the aspirational communities. That aspirational communities are the driving force of India's globalization and new consumer culture. And new consumer culture has also squeezed the space for rather expanded the space for further elaboration by bringing a new kind of thoughts and action, and squeeze the space for localized thoughts. So what we find within this culture of consumerism, emergence of nativity, digital natives, and emergence of social choices, new kind of protests are taking place. These protests are many times global and also related local. How these are local and global, take into consideration of the protest of the environmentalists. People talking in terms of climate change, talking about the protection of the forest, water, the environment. So all people talking about in terms of a common humanity, getting conscientized in terms of everyday flow of information, everyday is in terms of development with growth. Now that country had started talking about development with justice in terms of in 1960s and 70s. That country also talked about in terms of development with empowerment in 1990s. Now the country is talking about in terms of development of inclusion and development as happiness in 2020. So what we find, a globalization has brought in a new kind of a framework, new kind of a thought and action that is guiding the intellectual capability of the youth in this country. But notwithstanding that intellectual capability and wider choices, there has also been a negative dimension of globalization because globalization has created a wide variety of fluidity, and those within this fluidity, a kind of sense of rootlessness, a sense of identify falsehood as a truehood, as a true, and also a kind of a new kind of a frustration in the globalized world. And what has happened, that is trying to condition the people in terms of certain localized manifestation. So what we find, a kind of interconnectivity, both the localized need and localized formulation, and those localized formulation many times are expressed in terms of overemphasis on ethnicity and ethnic identity, and sense of rejection to the wider identity. So what is important in that context, that globalization that talks for a kind of rational choice, a kind of positivity of thought, a kind of interdependency and exchange, transformation and transcendence, those to be looked into in a positive sense. And society in India stands today in the crossroad that looks into the culture of globality and globalization on the one hand, and locality and localization on the other. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.